Last month, I had the honor and privilege of being a speaker at Tracy Dew's summit called the Hydrate Summit that she so graciously hosted at her house in San Diego. And it was like my all-star dream team of speakers that I got to be a part of, including people like Dr. Gerald Pollack, Robert Slovak, Robert Gourlay, just so many amazing minds. Oh, Veda Austin, holy cow, right? Like so many amazing, beautiful minds came together to speak passionately about water. And if you've been following me for any amount of time, you know that I absolutely love talking about water. And I especially love viewing the body and health through the lens of water. And one of the most interesting things that was presented was in Dr. Pollack's presentation. Now, for those of you who don't know Dr. Pollack, he is the researcher who coined the term EZ water or exclusion zone water. And for just a brief review, in case that's a new term for you, EZ water is actually the name for the water that lives inside of our cells. It actually has a different it's a different consistency, if you will, than the typical phases of water that we maybe have learned in elementary school. So we've learned that water is a solid in the form of ice, liquid water, right, in the form of liquid, and then gas in the form of water vapor. But what Dr. Pollack found was that the water inside of our cells exists in a phase that is between a solid and a liquid. If I were to look at the water molecules of a solid like ice under a microscope, I would see a very ordered hexagonal arrangement of the H's and the O's, right? So they would basically create what looked like a crystalline arrangement, a solid, very organized structure of the water molecules. And so that's actually what we find when we look at the water inside of our cells. This was unusual or not expected. Because the assumption for me and so many other people who have studied things like biology, medicine, biochemistry even, never really thought about the water inside of us as having a different structure. And not just a different structure, but a different consistency than what we would think of as typical water inside of a glass. And so the water actually inside of our cells also has this hexagonal arrangement, but we're not crystalline, we're not solid. And so we actually retain liquid properties, even though that water is structured very much like a crystal. So the water inside of us can be considered a liquid crystalline state of water that Dr. Pollack has coined EZ water or exclusion zone water. He gave it that name for a very specific reason, but I'm not going to go into that in this particular video. But what I do want to share in this video is how that exclusion zone water or EZ water stores charge. Now, it's very common knowledge, even amongst very mainstream knowledge, that the interior of each cell requires a certain amount of negative charge to maintain health. So, for example, a heart cell needs a negative charge relative to the outside of the cell of, let's say, negative 70 millivolts. Other cells, it's going to be closer to negative 20 to 25 millivolts. Certain cells, it's going to be negative 90 millivolts. But what you're going to hear is that negative, 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 right? That means that the interior of the cell has to have an electron-rich environment, also known as electrical or electricity, right? An electricity-rich environment. And it turns out that exclusion zone water alone can explain how a cell can maintain and store and hold this negative charge, this cellular voltage. And it's because the exclusion zone, when it forms this hexagonal lattice structure, the way it structures itself is that it actually holds electrons. In order to structure itself into this lattice, it has to kick out a proton. And so instead of staying neutral in terms of its charge like water in a glass, it actually has a negative charge because the proton was kicked out. And that means that the water inside of a cell alone can help to explain why and how a cell can maintain this storage depot of negative charge, which is synonymous with cellular health. So that's number one, right? Think about our cells full of this negatively charged EZ water. And yes, each cell requires a slightly different concentration, if you will, of this EZ water or charge, negative charge stored into this EZ water. But what's common across the board is that as these cells drain this exclusion zone water charge, this negative charge, a critical threshold is reached, and that cell starts to express dysfunction. And in fact, it drains to a certain point, and once a very critical threshold is reached, that is when a cell actually starts to get the signal to divide uncontrollably. It essentially reverts its metabolism to more of a glycolytic metabolism, a glycolysis or a Warburg style metabolism, which means it takes the mitochondria out of the picture, They're no longer doing oxidative phosphorylation. They're no longer making water, right? Which is, guess what? Mitochondria make the water that ultimately can become this exclusion zone water inside of the cell. And so we take the mitochondria out of the picture, and all of a sudden we have a cell that it's further and further drained of this negative charge and the water that holds this negative charge. And so because of that, that there's apparently some critical switch that Dr. Pollack pointed to that's true across a lot of different cell types. That actually every cell type that has been studied showed that once the cell drops to a critical threshold where it's lost its negative charge, it, like I said, it gets the signal to divide uncontrollably. And it doesn't always mean that this becomes a malignant tumor. It actually has been shown to result also in benign tumors or benign growths. But it's just to make note that there's a change in cell signaling and cell division once a critical threshold is reached. And so this to me says exclusion zone water and maintaining healthy amounts of exclusion zone water and therefore healthy cellular voltage is absolutely essential when it comes to cancer prevention. And so what could that look like for us? Well, for those of us that have been practicing different strategies for quite some time, it looks like doing things to maintain adequate amounts of exclusion zone water inside of the cell, an adequate negative charge inside of the cell and inside of the body. And from my opinion, it comes in a couple of different ways. Number one, we want to tend to the mitochondria so that they can make the water for us. We want to experience a certain range of sunlight on our skin that can also support this voltage. And we want to make sure we're consuming water that also has this beautiful negative charge associated with it. In fact, I learned from another speaker at that conference, Robert Gourlay, that when we would be drinking natural pristine water from nature, it would naturally have a charge of -50 to -100 millivolts. These days, water, when it's either stored stagnant in large vats or pumped through straight lines with angles, as it would in most municipal plumbing, that causes the water to lose its negative charge. So essentially, we're consuming water that doesn't have this beautiful charge that we're required to maintain for optimum health. And so again, if there's a company that you want to look into for the water itself, obviously I love spring water, naturally harvested spring water if possible. But again, Robert Gourlay's company also has done a beautiful job at creating products, both whole home, industrial, farm-based ones, and even one that I have that I love that just screws on top of two glass bottles, and you can vortex the water, and as the water vortexes, it imprints the water with this beautiful permanent negative charge. And so that's an option. And I think we'll probably be able to link that here below so that you can have access to that if you're interested. Again, it's not the only way, but I love it. It's a beautiful way to actually consume water that has the vital charge that our body needs to maintain health. Then, like I said, we want to talk about addressing the level of the mitochondria. What can we do to support the mitochondria and their ability to help us make this water? Well, in order to understand that, we have to recognize that there are certain light exposures that we need and other light exposures that are very challenging to mitochondrial health. So number one, artificial blue light can inhibit water production in the mitochondria. So picture all of the screens and the lighting technology we're around these days. It really is so dominant in that artificial blue wavelength range of light. And unfortunately, it's completely omitted the wavelength range of light that actually promotes water production inside of the mitochondria. And that would be the range of light that's called red and near infrared light. Now, remember, sunlight always contains red and near infrared light that we would want to get onto our naked skin whenever possible. Supplemental versions of this would be things like red light therapy devices, can be very beneficial at supporting mitochondria and their ability to produce this intracellular water for us. And then lastly, Dr. Pollack's lab found that there's a specific wavelength range of light that actually takes the exclusion zone water that we have and charges it back up, essentially like charging a depleted battery back to full capacity. And that's synonymous with also then helping a cell maintain that beautiful negative millivoltage that it needs. That's synonymous with health. And that wavelength range of light is called infrared light. And again, we get that from sunlight. So sunlight on the skin is a very important thing for us to get on a regular basis in order to allow our cells to hold this beautiful, healthy negative charge so that we can have that optimum cellular voltage. Again, there's supplemental versions of infrared. I think sauna can be used very beautifully. I think that even things like hot baths, hot springs in nature, even hot showers, right? Anytime we're exposed to the wavelength range of infrared that we feel as heat, we allow our bodies to essentially pull in that beautiful infrared light to charge up our exclusion zone water levels inside the body and then help to reestablish that healthy cellular voltage. So again, I just found this very fascinating. I knew already upon reading several articles prior to going to the conference that there was likely a reduction in ordered water or structured water inside of cancerous cells. But when Dr. Pollack tied it to the research that showed that structured water, when we lost exclusion zone water, we lost that voltage, all of a sudden the cells get the signal to divide uncontrollably. For me, that was just an aha moment of how important it is to understand healthy cellular function through the lens of exclusion zone water and healthy cellular voltage. And if we can start to do things in our life that helps us to maintain that healthy cellular charge, that exclusion zone water, it goes a long way towards supporting a body that is healthy and thriving and just full of vital life force energy.